Hi everyone, I'm Kennan from Cars and Bids, and today we're talking about this. This is a 1995 Ferrari F355 Spider, but it's not just any 355, it's my 355. And it's not just that, it's also my dream car. And today we're going to talk about the facts and figures of the 355 by beginning with some of its history and where it fits into Ferrari's past. Then we'll talk over some of the nerdy technical specifications of this car. And then I'll tell you about my ownership experience and dispel some of the myths and legends that are around the 355. And lastly, we'll take it for a drive. And with that, let's get started. Before we get going, big news, my F355 is for sale, currently being auctioned live on, you guessed it, Cars and Bids. And I'm offering this one with no reserve, which means whoever wins that auction goes home with my F355. As I mentioned, this is a 1995 model, which means it comes equipped with the desirable gated 6-speed manual transmission. It also has some performance modifications and reliability modifications, such as 2B headers and a 2B exhaust and a rear challenge grille. It's also finished in this gorgeous shade of Rosso Barchetta, and it comes with a lot of service documentation detailing a recent major service, replacement of the clutch, convertible top service, and a lot more. So, after you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below where you can head to the live auction of my 355, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. The F355 is the fourth car in the entry-level mid-engine V8 class of Ferrari that was introduced with the 308 in the late 1970s. That car would evolve into the 328 in the 1980s, which would receive a lot of technical updates, but would look very similar to the original 308. Then in the late 80s came the 348, which represented a completely different design because it now had a longitudinally mounted engine in the back, and it had different cooling. It also had baby Testarossa styling with those famed side strakes, and that was the platform for this, the 355, which came out in 1994 and was produced until 1999. The 355 was a big deal, and it was a really important car for Ferrari, as the 348 wasn't that well received when it came out. It wasn't particularly fast, and it was kind of finicky, so much so that Car and Driver actually tested that car against the GMC Cyclone because they were comparable in terms of speed. It didn't help that Honda/Acura came out with the NSX during the same time, which proved that you could have an exotic-looking mid-engine sports car that could be fast and reliable, and so Ferrari needed to respond to that, and they did so with the 355. Although the two cars look very similar, Ferrari spent over 1,000 hours in the wind tunnel refining the shape of this car, making it even more aerodynamic than its predecessor. But aerodynamics weren't the only area that Ferrari invested in. The big area where they put the most money into to make it better than the 348 was the engine. And here it is, the glorious F129B 3.5 liter 5-valve per cylinder V8. Now that's quite a mouthful to say, but this is the heart of the 355, its engine, and it has a lot of updates compared to the 348's engine. In addition to being slightly larger, the 348 had a 3.4 liter engine, this car has a 3.5. The key thing with this car is the cylinder head, because it received 5 valves per cylinder, hence the name 355. Now what does that actually mean? Well, it means that it has 3 intake valves and 2 for the exhaust. And the benefit of this is that you're able to get more air into the combustion chamber, meaning that it makes more power. And it was quite a jump. Over the 348 Spider, which made about 320 horsepower, this car now makes about 380. And again, 1/10 of a liter in displacement isn't going to make that up. What's actually going to make the difference is that 5th valve located in the cylinder head. The cylinder head wasn't the only thing that Ferrari revised, as they also upgraded the engine internals for this car. The compression ratio would rise to 11:1, which is very high, especially for a car from the 1990s. And so Ferrari introduced things like titanium alloy connecting rods so that it could handle the internal pressures of this car, making more performance. The exhaust was another area that Ferrari upgraded with this car, and they added a valved exhaust system. The way this works is that as you climb up the RPMs, a vacuum operated valve opens, allowing the exhaust to breathe more freely. But Ferrari was very cheeky about this because when that valve operates, it bypasses the catalytic converters. That's right, basically as you go faster in this car, it straight pipes itself. Frankly, I'm shocked that Ferrari was able to get away with this even in the 1990s. They certainly couldn't get away with it today, but it's part of the reason why this car sounds so great and performs so well. Now, as I mentioned, this is an F129B V8. More specifically, this is referred to as the Motronic 2.7 engine, and that's because Ferrari offered two different engine management systems with this car. The early cars like this have the 2.7, and the later cars have the Bosch Motronic 5.2 unit. And in this car, the 2.7 is kind of interesting because it basically has two of everything. You have two mass airflow sensors, which sits behind these airboxes. You have two throttle position sensors, and you have two ECUs. There are two computers that control this engine, and they basically run it as two sets of 4 cylinders. This was relatively common for Ferraris at the time. The F40 is also like this, but it is kind of an unusual quirk and kind of complicated. But the cars got a little bit more simple with the 5.2 system, where they had one MAF, one computer, and just a more simple system in general. It's believed that these cars make slightly more power than the later cars. They only make about 5 more horsepower, but generally people feel that these engines are a little bit more punchy. That's kind of up to debate, but regardless, this car has the 2.7 system as it's a very early F355. The engine wasn't the only part of the driveline that Ferrari focused on improving, and the most obvious place to see what they improved is here in the middle with the gated 6-speed manual transmission. That's right, it gained a 6th gear over the 348's 5-speed manual transmission. It was a big deal because it meant this car could achieve a higher top speed, and sports cars were all getting 6 speeds at that time, so it was important that Ferrari added a 6-speed to the 355. In addition to adding a 6th gear, Ferrari also upgraded the shifting mechanism for this transmission. Instead of using shift cables that were found in the 348, they switched to a shift rod, which meant that it had a more direct, crisp shift, but that it was also easier to shift gears, so you could enjoy this great transmission even more on a day-to-day basis. In keeping with that theme of making this car more easy to use every day, Ferrari added a first to the V8 line, and that was power steering. Now, it's largely agreed that this isn't their best attempt as it was their first try, and the steering rack is kind of slow and kind of vague and very heavily assisted, but you had power steering in this car, which meant you didn't have to wrestle the steering wheel as you were trying to navigate tight turns at low speeds. Another first for the V8 Ferrari line was an adjustable suspension. That's right, in the 1990s, Ferrari was putting an adjustable suspension on a 355, and it's actuated by flipping the switch located here in the center console. When you flip that switch, it activates 4 motors, one located on top of each strut that turn a gear, increasing the shock pressure of each shock absorber, giving you a more sporty ride. Today, of course, we have adaptive suspension systems that are way more advanced than this, but it all began here for the V8 Ferrari line with the 355. Now, clearly, I'm sitting in the Spider version of this car, and Ferrari made 3 variants. They made the Berlinetta Coupe, which is extraordinarily beautiful and very sought after today, the GTS, which had a lift-out roof section, but gave you the best of both worlds, both the coupe look and the convertible design, and then there was this, the Spider, which gives you access to all of this up here, a huge open driving experience. Now, the key thing with this car is that it was the first Ferrari to have a power-operated top. And it's relatively rudimentary, but it does exist. The way it works is that you have to remove this leather tonneau cover, which in my experience, so you start with the outermost buttons. You place your fingers around them, lift up, and they will release. Start with those and work your way inward. Then do the next 2 that are most close to the car, and then work on your last ones, and then it comes off with relative ease. But once you have that off, you get back in the car, put the parking brake on, and then you can begin to operate the top. And that's done with the switch located here in the middle. When you push up on the switch, both seats will whir forward slowly on their electric motors, giving the top room to clear as it goes up. Then 2 sets of hydraulic rams will lift the top up into its first position, which kind of gives you the look of these flying buttresses that are found on the coupe. And then there are 2 more hydraulic rams that will operate to push the top forward as it closes. Now, it's important to note that this sequence is relatively complex for this car, as it was their first attempt, and any interruption during this sequence will set you back and you'll have to start the whole thing over again. So wait until the car finishes doing it once the top is up. To put the top down, it's relatively easy. You release the top first, and then push up on this bar located in the middle. When you do that, the car will beep, letting you know that it's in the position to go down, and then you can operate the switch again. Simply pull back on it, and the top will start to work its way down. Again, using those hydraulic rams to retract the top first, before then it lowers itself back into the car. And then you're ready to drive your Ferrari with your top down. And I know everybody loves seeing the tops go up and down in these cars, so here's a full video sequence of the top going up and the top going down. And now I want to talk about my ownership experience with the 355. But first I have to give you a little bit of backstory because this car is very important to me. When I was about 10 years old, my friend's dad bought a 1998 Ferrari 355 F1 Spider. And at the time, that was the more desirable model because F1 was the new hot thing. This was about 2005. And one summer night in May, I'll never forget it, he brought it over to our house to show off his new car. Now, I didn't really know what a Ferrari was at that time. I wasn't really into cars, but he offered to take me for a ride and I will never forget it. I remember not being able to figure out how to open the door because the door handle is located inside of the air intake, but we got in the car eventually and we drove around. He took it up to the main road in front of our neighborhood and nailed it. And I remember vividly the sound of this car, the smell, and just the sheer exotic experience of it. And I was in love. I fell in love with cars from that day forward and I was absolutely obsessed. I swear to God, I'm not making it up. When I got out of that car, I said, Ferrari, I'm going to have to remember that name. And ever since that moment, I was obsessed with Ferraris. So much so I used to buy the little models and bring them to school, and everybody knew that Kennan was obsessed with Ferraris. And so I set the goal of owning a 355. It was my dream car. And late last year, I finally made it happen. I bought my very own Ferrari F355. And it was a huge deal to me. When the car showed up, there was a lot of fanfare. Doug was there along with some of my other friends. My parents came out from Ohio to San Diego to see it delivered. And it was a dream come true. Like I said, I had my own Ferrari. And I loved driving it. I loved the sound of this car and the way that it drove. But as great as that period of time was, the honeymoon phase came to an end pretty quickly when I got to experience my first dosage of Ferrari maintenance. Now, this car had been serviced very thoroughly throughout its life, but we ran into an issue with the exhaust. It wasn't installed correctly, and as a result, it was spewing hot air over the CV boots. And one day when I went out for a drive, one of them ruptured and slung grease everywhere in the engine bay. It was an annoyance, but I was not deterred. I took it to a Ferrari service place here in San Diego, an independent specialist who was able to rectify the car and get it running again properly. But that wasn't the only issue that we ran into. We also found that the clutch needed to be replaced, which I had to do, and we found that one of my headers was cracked, which I'll get to in a moment. But I rectified all of this stuff, and even so, I now had the 355 running properly. But then I ran into voltage issues and I had to rectify that problem. Then the top wouldn't go up and down properly and I had to fix that. And so it became all of these things that I had to fix. And now the car is sorted out properly, but every time I drive it, I'm just scared about what's going to happen next. And again, it's driving great now and running beautifully, but it just weighs on me every time I use this car. And additionally, I've kind of outgrown the 355 in some ways. When I was 10 years old, this was the ultimate car. I couldn't imagine anything better than this. But as I've gotten older, I've come to love more GT-focused cars as opposed to sports cars. I have my E39 M5 and I love that car very much, but that's more the kind of car I like. Big power highway bruisers is the kind of car Kennan has come to love. So that is why I'm selling my 355. Although it is a wonderful car and I now have it sorted properly, I think I'm just emotionally over this car. I've owned it for about 9 months and put over 2,000 miles on it, so I've done a lot of cool driving and made some great memories, and now I'm ready to pass it on to the next owner. And with that in mind, I wanted to dispel some of the myths and legends around the 355, and we're going to start with some of its known issues. We're going to begin with the valve guides of this car. They're a known failure point, especially on early 355s, as they were made of a brass alloy. Now, Ferrari decided to make it out of this material because that's how they made their racing engines. Brass is a soft material, which means that the valves are able to move easily through it and don't need a lot of lubrication in order to do so. And that's fine on a racing engine where maybe you replace the engine after every race or so. But when it's on a road car that has to last tens of thousands of miles, well, that's not so great, and it's a common issue to have with 355s. The best way to see if your car is affected by this is to have a compression test done. And if there's a lot of variance between the cylinders, you know that chances are the valve guides are starting to go. A key way to see this is particularly on cylinders 4 and cylinder 6. If they have very high or very low compression, you have an issue. The reason they might have very high compression is there's excess blow-by as the valve guides wear out, creating a seal around the cylinder, thus increasing the compression in the cylinder and raising that number. That's an important area to check if you have one of these cars, and I just had a compression test done on this, and the engine looks very healthy. I also have documentation that corresponds to the valve guides being replaced on this engine, so that won't be an issue again with this 355. Another common failure point on this car would be the headers. Ferrari was frankly cheap, and the headers were very thin on these cars. And as this engine makes a lot of heat, they would crack and create problems, largely related to the catalytic converters. The easiest way to tell if your car has this issue is to listen to the engine. If you can hear a ticking sound coming from the engine, that very well could be your headers. And if you catch it in time, you'll be okay. When this car showed up, it had that issue despite having the headers already replaced. And rectifying it wasn't as bad as I thought. My shop only charged me 2 hours of labor to remove and reinstall the headers, so it really didn't cost me all that much to fix that particular problem. But now the headers have been repaired and this car is ready to drive. The 355 is also known for, well, catching on fire. As one of the bigger issues with this car, Ferrari issued a recall for this. And the reason they're known for catching on fire has to do with the fuel lines. And it's because they're located too close to the coolant lines. There's a band clamp on the coolant lines that rubs against the fuel lines, eventually rupturing them and pouring fuel onto your headers, which are all right there in the engine bay. Ferrari rectified this issue by issuing a new valve block for the fuel system, which lifted it up a little bit higher, meaning that it now cleared those coolant lines. This car has had that recall done. It's very easy to spot because you can see the fuel lines very clearly, but it's a very important thing to make sure that has been done so that you can drive your 355 in relative safety. Compared to those issues, there are some relatively minor things that 355 struggle with as well. One of which would be sticky plastics. All of the plastics in this car were originally covered with a coating that made them kind of soft touch and look very nice, but over time, that coating wears out and turns into this disgusting black goop. So every time you touch a switch in this car, you get this kind of muck all over your hands. This car has had that dealt with as well. All of the vents and the center console stuff in this car has been refinished, so you no longer have to deal with that. It's not cheap though. It costs about $5,000 to do that, but the previous owner of this car had it done, so there's no sticky stuff on the inside of this 355. Another area this car does actually struggle with is dash shrinkage. The dashboards were stretched relatively tight on this car, so the leather is relatively thin, and it means that over time, the leather will start to peel back. And on this car, it's relatively minor, but it's a common issue with 355s. And it hasn't been so bad that I've needed to rectify it, but it is something that you should know about if you're looking to buy this 355. Okay, it's time to do the best thing with the 355 and go out and drive it. Oh, the sound. Let's talk about that sound. I truly feel that the reason you buy this car is twofold. One, because of the way it looks, and two, because of the way it sounds. It's just spectacular. Oh, it's so good. As I mentioned, when I was a little kid, that's really what I fell in love with, was the way this car sounds. It's so exotic and just so, it's so lovely. And of course, this car redlines over 8,000, so it's just a joy to ring it all the way up to the top, and it just sounds incredible when you do that. Now, granted, this car doesn't really make all that much horsepower. You know, there are cars that are plenty fast today. My M5 personally feels a little bit faster because it makes 100 foot-pounds of torque more than this car does. But that doesn't mean that this car is slow. It's just that it's not particularly fast. But that's really not the point of the 355. The point is more that it's just an enjoyable experience, and a lot of that is derived from the way it sounds. That and using this gated manual transmission, which you can hear me like just playing with. I always thought the gated manual was like overrated, but having lived with it now for a while and having driven it a lot, I assure you it isn't. And this change is so nice. The revised version of this car from the 348, you know, going to a shift rod as opposed to shift cables, made a big difference. Sometimes those early 5-speed boxes in the 348 and the 308 and 328, you kind of feel like you're like braking it. It just isn't all that pleasant of a shift all the time. But the transmission's a real sweetheart. But again, let's go back to that sound because, come on. Oh, so good. I realize now I should put the windows up too. But I hope that comes through how glorious that is, because the sound is just fabulous. And the thing I've come to love about that is, like, although it sounds like I'm doing like 1,000,000 miles an hour, I'm not really going that much over the speed limit. And I think that's one of the most enjoyable parts about this car is that like you can enjoy it kind of at legal, normal speeds, and it delivers that exotic experience without really sending you to jail, which I think is a very positive thing with this car. What a delight. Oh my God, I'm gonna miss that sound. So some of the surprises I've had in owning this car and having driven it a lot now, one is the ride quality. It's very comfortable. Like you can drive this car. Honestly, if it had cruise control, you could take it on road trips and be pretty comfy in it. You know, this was the 1990s. It wasn't, you know, cars weren't so bone shattering like some of them are today in terms of the ride quality. And so it kind of makes sense that it rides. It's relatively nicely damped. And yeah, but for a sports car and, you know, being this exotic Ferrari and looking the way it does, you'd probably expect it to be a little bit more harsh riding, but it certainly is not that. And so let's talk about some of the dislikes. So the steering for me is one of the things I really don't like about this car, and that's a very common complaint with the 355. As I mentioned, it was their first attempt at power steering, and it's very over-assisted and very vague. You have to really crank that steering wheel a lot more than you think you have to. So that can kind of catch you off guard sometimes. So yeah, so the steering for me is one of the gripes I have about this car. I also find that it rolls a lot more than I was expecting it to. In really tight, twisty stuff, it kind of leans a lot. You kind of have to set the car up when you go into the corner. When you do though, it's just a lot of fun. The chassis in this car is incredibly fun to use. And that coupled with relatively adequate power, but more importantly, a great sound just equates to a really lovely driving experience. And this car just delivers that really well. You know, Luca de Montezemolo, the former chairman of Ferrari, once said that at Ferrari, it's very cheesy, but it's true. At Ferrari, we don't build cars, we build dreams. And the 355 as an experience is about as great of a dream as you could possibly imagine. I just wish these cars were a little bit more reliable. Like I said, I think I have sorted this one out pretty nicely now. What a special, special thing this car is. Very special. And that is the Ferrari F355. This is a truly beautiful car that comes with a gated 6-speed manual transmission and that glorious naturally aspirated 5-valve per cylinder V8. This car, dollar for dollar, delivers the Ferrari experience, in my opinion, better than any other car. And I've really enjoyed a lot of the moments I've had with this car, as it was a seminal car in my life. And if you feel the same way about the 355, well, you can bid on this one and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon. Goodbye.